add to that introduction of Martha two things. I first got to know her writing back in 2019, I think it was, when she wrote a piece for Sarah Kent Milam for the journal Gravy. I knew she was something special then and got so excited when I heard about this book from Hub City Press. I'm not the only person who got excited about this book. I read a recent review in chapter 16, which, if you don't know it, is something an organization I really admire, funded by Humanities Tennessee. They create book reviews and features to serve the state of Tennessee and then self-syndicate them out to newspapers and other outlets. Chapter 16 said that Martha's book is a deeply felt and carefully investigated collection about faith and science, an ode to the sacred mess of living, stitched together with blood, breath, and love. So let's start, Martha, with this object, this book you have in your hand. I want to know how the title came to be. You already begun a conversation with Lee Durkee a moment ago about the title. And I also want to know how the image came to be married with the title, where they began. Tell us about the object itself.
Yeah, I love thinking of it as an object because that was always my dream, was to make an object that cohered and felt like a little being unto itself. And in my head, the book was always called World Without End. There's an essay inside by the title. And that came from the Gloria Patri, which in the book I call the doxology, and my dad told me that was wrong, but it was too late. So we would sing the Gloria Patri in church, and I loved it. It ended with, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end, amen, amen. And I loved the way it had this very plaintive sound at the end of the song, where it sounded kind of like it was hedging its own bets a little bit. And I loved the idea. I'm thinking about a lot of different Christian ideas around apocalypse, and I liked the idea of having these lines from a song that seemed to kind of refute the idea of apocalypse as maybe people tend to think about it. And but then I had turned my manuscript in. My daughter came a few weeks early last year, and so I think she was 2 weeks old, and my publisher emailed me and said, there's too many books with this title, you have to change it. And I was just like, I can't. That ship has sailed. This is the title of the book. I can't. Well, and so they said, well, you can add a subtitle, because they sent other ideas for titles, and they just didn't feel right. And so they said, we can come up with a subtitle. So I think I sent them 3 or 4 different ideas for a subtitle, just in a kind of sleep-deprived haze. And they were essays on apocalypse and after-war work. And I felt I hope I don't get to the point where this book comes out and that feels weird to me, because it came up with in such a weird point in my life. But I think I've grown more attached to the subtitle over time, and I like having apocalypse in there. And then the image of the roseate spoonbills, there's an essay late in the book where,
This image.
These guys. There's an essay late in the book where they occur as kind of an important character in a story, which we can talk about now or later, but they kind of were a really surprising character that appeared on the scene in Arkansas in a former rice farm. And so they just kind of spoke to me of an element of surprise in a story for myself, and I just they became a little symbol in my own brain, and I liked having them on the cover. They're kind of a main character for me.
And we're going to walk through a few of the pieces in the collection, and Martha's going to read some, and we're going to talk about some, but I wanted to, even before that, I wanted to talk about how the images in this collection and the words in this collection, how they talk to one another and what they have to say to one another.
Yeah, so I had just written this as just text, and my publisher suggested that I add illustrations, which was so cool. And I think I don't have any other experience publishing a book, but it seemed like one of the real pleasures of working with a smaller independent press, that they wanted to expand my vision of my own project in a way that I kind of expected I would have to make it smaller. And so they encouraged doing an illustration for every essay, and then I also have spot illustrations in some of the larger pieces to kind of break them up and illustrate them a bit. And I think it's just, for me, I wrote these essays over the course of a decade, and making the illustrations just really felt kind of like cinching them all up together. Like it was the present day person coming through and kind of sewing them all together through these illustrations. And, I've talked to people who are like, well, that's fine, but it would work without them. But I think for my own internal process, it was a way of drawing them all together. And the essays take place all over the South and have all different kinds of stories that they're working through, and something about just doing drawings for each of them just made them feel like they were all in a room together talking to each other.
When you said you began these essays, some of them a decade ago?
Yeah, the first essay in the book was in my graduate thesis. I graduated 10 years ago. I think like right now. And then most of the rest of them were written since like 2020. I kind of had a period where I thought I was writing more of a memoir. My husband and I moved to Memphis for a lot of reasons, but one of them was that when my dad told me he was retiring from the ministry, I kind of just freaked out and wasn't expecting the impact it was going to have on me. And the way I write about it in the book is that, like, as long as he was in a church somewhere in the world on Sunday morning, there was still a door held open for me. And I didn't realize when I imagined that there was going to be nowhere in the world on a Sunday morning that I could find him in a church, that the feeling it had for me was like, you've got to figure this out now because the door is closing. And so we moved to Memphis, and I attended church for his last year. And there was a period where I thought I was writing more of a memoir. And then around 2020, I started doing more journalism and writing more reported pieces, and realized how much not only did I like writing about other people, but I felt like they were drawing me deeper into my own story and leading me to questions that I wouldn't have found otherwise without them. So that's when things kind of shifted for me.
Can you give an example of that depth that you managed in the middle of that transition?
Yeah, so one of my favorite essays to write was about, is it okay to talk about cemeteries?
Yeah, what do you want to?
There's a piece in the book about conservation cemeteries, which is cemeteries that they fund preservation of land through burying people in the land without using a coffin or embalming or anything like that. They'll use like a pine box or a shroud. I wrote a story about 4 different conservation cemeteries in South Carolina and Tennessee. And I started out the story thinking this would be a helpful way into thinking about faith and the environment, because they're just naturally blended here. You've got the end of a person's life, people gathering around them to honor them, and putting them into the ground quite literally. And so it seems like all the questions I'm most interested in are going to be happening here. And then as I was talking to different people at these cemeteries, I realized I kept telling them this story about seeing my dad, after he retired, burning his sermons in the backyard and how much it had upset me. And there was, I think the 4th cemetery I went to, I was just repeating the story. Like I did not know why I kept telling people about this. And no one was telling me. They were just kind of like, oh, weird, okay. And the woman at the 4th cemetery, she was like a death doula, and she had buried her mother in the cemetery, and it had kind of become her whole life. And I told her about seeing my dad burn these sermons in the backyard, and she said, y'all have experienced a death, and he's figured out a ritual to work his way through that, and now you have to find yours. And the way she said it was just, it changed the story from something that felt confusing and very sad to something that felt creative and had a place for kind of improvisation, and had a lot of possibility that I hadn't expected. And I think that was a moment when I was like, it's not only that I love writing stories about these people and getting to know them, it's that they're also helping me get to know myself and changing the story I'm telling about myself too.
If you back way up from where we are now and think about this collection of essays which add up to something, by my reading, you weave the personal, the political, the reported, the spiritual, all together here. And I wonder if you would explain to us, from your perspective, I just told you what I thought you were doing. If you explain to us from your perspective, what it is you attempted to do in that week, and as readers, what we might receive on the other end.
I think a lot of the essays that are more reported essays have an element of some environmental problem or conservation, and then an element of faith or spirituality in them, and they're all very connected to like current life. They're not like removed in any way from contemporary life. And so like one of the essays is about the search for the ivory-billed woodpecker in Arkansas, and the kind of camps that either believe it still exists or that believe the bird has gone extinct. And what I was really interested in was the way I kept seeing spiritual kind of language pop up in those conversations. Like you were either a believer or a skeptic. There were these kind of binaries. And people kept talking about like either resurrecting the bird or resurrecting the bird's habitat. And I was really interested in like, do we all have a commonly held definition for resurrection? Do we all know we're talking about the same thing? And so, and resurrection is something that I've always been kind of confused about how I felt about it, so it seemed like an opportunity for me to learn about the way the meaning of resurrection has changed over time, what different interpretations exist. And through that story, I talked to a lot of people that had worked at like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Arkansas, who were so cagey and protective about what they felt about the ivory bill. And then I met this farmer who had enlisted his farm using the Wetland Reserve Program, which were funds set up to like resurrect wetland habitat to make homes for ivory-billed woodpeckers. And so he had this rice farm that wasn't doing that well, so he signed up for the Wetland Reserve Program and just created this, 1,000-acre swamp in the middle of Arkansas, thinking this might be habitat for the ivory-billed woodpecker. And then what's happened was every spring, these flocks of roseate spoonbills started showing up and nesting there. And they typically nest south in Florida, along the coast. And in some places in Florida, they were seeing like 10% of the population they would normally see show up. And that was from sea level rise, saltwater incursion damaging the mangroves. Like they had all these issues, but the birds had been able to find this other hospitable habitat that had been created thinking of a different creature, but it was a perfect home for them. And I think one of the things I really loved in reporting that essay was I talked to a U.S. Fish and Wildlife forester who had been working during the ivory bill shebang. And what he told me was that he felt like they had to act as if it was possible for the bird to be there. And I thought that was such a nice step outside of the binary of it wasn't did he believe or doubt that the bird was there, but he could act as if the bird might be there. And that to me was helpful personally as I was kind of thinking through different theologies around resurrection and interpretations, that always looking for kind of a third space outside of those binaries. And so that was the way all those kind of stories wove together for me in that process.
We've talked a lot about the book. I'd kind of like to hear you read a selection or two from the book.
Sure.
We talked about a few you might do.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that.
No, it's okay.
Let me see. So I have an essay about this tree called the Florida Torreya. And it's one of the most rare trees in the world. It only grows in a little section of the Panhandle in Florida along the Apalachicola River. And it's not able to sexually reproduce. It just sends up these little baby trees that don't make it to maturity. And so there are some people in the Panhandle that are trying to save this tree, but they're all kind of at odds with each other. Some people think it needs to be saved in the Panhandle, and other people think it needs to be manually evacuated farther north to live in cooler climates. And so it's kind of become this little controversy. And so toward the end of this essay, what I was really interested in is whenever you're writing about the climate crisis, there's a question of do you have hope for the future? And so this kind of section starts with a conversation with a woman named Donna, who is very devoted to these trees on her. She just happened to buy a piece of land that had these trees growing on it. So this starts with Donna. When I asked Donna whether she had hoped that the Torreya could make a comeback, she said, "My attitude with the Torreya is that it's gone unless someone could bring it back. In the end, she said, the tree's future is in the hands of the scientists at the Atlanta Botanical Garden. Its DNA is with them. Knowing this makes me feel a little bit eternal, she said. The fact that science will bring this to fruition is a beautiful marriage to me, not a conflict. There's great faith on both sides. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, I have great hope, she said finally. I know something about tomorrow. In my conversations with people trying to save the Torreya, I noticed specific moments in which they seemed hopeful for the tree's future. But perhaps more often they seemed to do the work without much hope at all. Instead, the work itself was its own remedy against despair, against assuming that all was already lost. Talking to them, I began to get a sense of hope on a different scale, with an aperture opening beyond a specific tree's specific fate. Perhaps something like what the writer Adrian Shert calls theological hope, which she defines not as simply longing for Eden, but a longing that is mobilizing, resistant, that leads us to each other, and maybe to a garden, even if it's a long way off. This kind of hope moves beyond the survival of a single endangered tree, even perhaps our own individual survival, to a greater reconciliation. All souls descend a ladder from heaven to the world, writes Abraham Joshua Heschel. Then the ladders are taken away. If this is true, perhaps the goal is to quit looking around for another ladder, for our escape from this world to a paradise that we vaguely, achingly remember, and instead tend to the world around us as if it were or could be paradise itself. What we witness now is not the end of the world, but the end of many worlds, perhaps more worlds than we knew we had to lose. The world of the American chestnut, the white bark pine, the maple leaf oak, the eastern hemlock, and one day, perhaps very soon, the world of the Florida Torreya. But as the Torreya's extinction has become arguably more likely, people devoted to the tree have become less willing to admit it. They are compelled instead to build whatever arcs need to be built.
Thank you. Listening to that reminds me, I said to you before that your work reminded me in some ways of Eula Biss, that her great collection of essays, Notes from No Man's Land, the way you synthesize and leap, the reader leaps with you. Reading that, listening to that reminds me too of Jenny Schwed, and some world that exists between those two great writers.
Thanks.
You're welcome. I know your father there in the blue shirt. I hope you didn't mind me calling him out. And he's very much a presence in this, that your father used you in sermons, and you give us examples of that. And then now you're using him. And he's not any longer. He's a character in this book. Now, talk to us about the evolution of that, and if there's an illustrative piece.
And I just remember as a kid, like, knowing it was his sermon writing time, and that was kind of a second, like, sacred period of the week, you know. And I think that just built in me a real reverence for writing, and I think the care in which he used us in sermons, and the fact that we could just be playful about it. Like, I would be coming to church and he'd be like, "I'm using you today," and I would not have any other information. But I never felt embarrassed or picked. You know, it's like you get to see. It's like showing up, and when he was using me, it was like I got to see in public that he loved me and was entertained by something I did that week, or you know, like that's a gift. And I think it also taught me that I think there's a lot of questions about writing about family, and I didn't have a lot of concerns about that because I grew up being able to tolerate it, and I had a model for it. And yeah, he gets whatever's coming to him. But would you like me to read a little bit from that essay? Okay.
Careful, please.
I got it.
Judicious choices your father asked for.
I know.
You deserve judicious choices.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, I'll read a little bit from here. I think so. Okay. When I was a kid, my dad took me to school and picked me up every day. Sometimes on our way home from school, he'd buy us chocolate Frosties from Wendy's, and we'd drive home listening to Rush Limbaugh so that, as my dad said, we would know what the enemy was saying. But conservative Christianity seemed to me a quirky and unlikely phenomenon. By the time I arrived in college in a small town in Ohio, I had the impression that Christianity would lead a person to progressive politics. My college writing professor was the first person to tell me that my experience in the church in the South was the exception and not the rule. As I've grown accustomed to describing all church wasn't, it's become harder to say what it was. What did it add up to? The creaking sanctuary floors, the carpets stained with grape juice, the altars studded with dripped candle wax. All those hours we spent there, where did they lead? In theory, the forms provided by organized religion, while inherently and necessarily flawed, could be fruitful. The constraints of an organized structure could create space for resistance. One could envision and refine one's own sense of the divine by running up against what it was not. But in practice, the business of church rarely felt like a container against which my soul could hone itself. It was mostly tedious and frustrating, and often felt utterly disconnected from the original impulse that led any of us there in the first place. I always imagined that the time would come for me to decide what I believed, how I felt about faith in the church and the religion I'd been steeped in. And I assumed that time would arrive with some kind of force from somewhere outside myself. While my dad was a pastor, I dammed up my unresolved feelings about it all, assuming that as long as my father was somewhere climbing into a pulpit each Sunday morning, I could step back into the stream uninterrupted. But when he stopped, when he gathered up his papers and his worn Bible and exited the sanctuary for good, when the only access point that I'd known was taken away, where would that leave me? When I decided to attend my father's church for his last year, I hadn't gone to church regularly since before I turned 18. Now, 28 years old, living next door to my parents, I felt I'd entered some strange time machine. Here I was again, climbing into the car with my mom on Sunday morning for a long drive to church. After more than a decade away, it was strange to enter each weekend, remembering that my Sunday was already spoken for. The Sundays weren't mine anymore. No brunch with friends, no walks in the park, no lazy Sunday mornings reading in pajamas. Church bulletins piled up, falling out of my bags, my books, my jacket pockets, with notes and grocery lists scrawled between the hymns and prayer requests. None of my friends go to church, and there was no one my age in my father's congregation. Much has been made of the rise of the nuns, the growing number of Americans, especially those in my age bracket, who, in response to surveys asking for their religious affiliation, increasingly answer none. This is the box my friends would have checked, and the box I always assumed I would check too if I were ever handed a survey. And yet, when my dad decided to retire earlier than I expected, I felt an urgent need to be there in his church every Sunday to encounter head-on what I'd always preferred to skirt the edges of. What it meant or means to have grown up in these spaces, these churches perched on lonely highways or tucked into nondescript neighborhoods, where I often felt like a stranger, even though everyone knew my name.
So we probably have time for one more question and reading, if that's good by you. And then we'll open it up for questions from y'all. The last essay in the collection, which connects through the whole, but is also a bit of a departure, wound care. Talk to us about why you close a collection like this, a roving collection like this, with an essay.
So I really think of the essays not as like a collection that just happened to be together, but that are really going on a journey together. And the last essay in the book is, so I kind of think of the essays in here as kind of like three groups. And it's like really, 80% of them, it's like nature essays that are, nature, faith, spirituality, South, all that. Then there's another group that's like about growing up in the church, trying to figure out how I feel about faith. My dad's retiring with that. And then there's just one essay at the end that's just kind of out of nowhere. That's just a purely personal essay about my experience giving birth to my son. And it felt like it was where I had actually landed as a person through the experience of writing this book. And so even though like formally and thematically, I think it's a departure, I think I kind of made a departure. And so it felt right to end the book there. And so I will read a little bit from it, and then we can talk about it. So my son, this is one of the things I'm always trying to parse in this essay. It's like, did he have a traumatic birth, or did we have a traumatic birth? I don't know. We had a bad time. And I gave birth in September of 2020, so it was like wearing a mask, no visitors in the hospital, very bleak. Like, my son recently asked me what the doctor looked like who delivered him, and I was like, I have no idea. And so we had a bad birth, bad healing afterwards. I got an infection, had to be treated at the hospital, getting like IV antibiotics, and then after that experience, I kind of wrote about like kind of a bodily experience of faith that I hadn't had before, that I kind of had through his birth. One of my friends who was raised in conservative, charismatic churches likes to argue with me about the liberal Protestant penchant for metaphors and symbolic interpretations. It just seems to me that something has to be literally true, he said one day over the phone. It can't all just be a metaphor. I was out on a walk when he called, and it had started to drizzle. I stood out of the rain under a neighbor's large cypress tree, the phone pressed to my ear. But I don't think of metaphors as just, I said, something I didn't know I believed until I said it. If metaphors are how we can most effectively describe our pain to each other, and if metaphors are how we can most clearly describe God or articulate the presence of an ineffable something that so many of us apprehend, then it seems to me that metaphors might be as close as we can get to the thing itself, to healing, to what is holy. That day, my friend and I had been talking about the story from Exodus of the burning bush. I was telling him about a translation I'd recently encountered. When Moses asked to know God's name, the name God gives Moses in Hebrew is Aa Asher Aa. In most versions of the Bible that I grew up with, this is translated as I am who I am, or I am that I am. But this translation doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Rabbi Lawrence Kushner writes that biblical Hebrew has only two tenses, usually called past and future, but more precisely perfect and imperfect. These tenses describe actions as either complete or incomplete. By answering Aa Asher Aa, Kushner writes, God uses not the present and static I am that I am, or even the dynamic I will be who I will be, but the yet imperfect I am not yet who I am not yet. God in effect says, I am still myself becoming. If the story of the burning bush is a metaphor, and I believe it is, it might reveal that God is found not in the healing of the bush, or in the restoration of the bush to its pre-burned state. Instead, God is embodied by a fire that burns without ceasing, but also without consuming. Metaphor is a talking cure, the writer Catherine Madsen writes. It starts at the point of injury. If all we have in the end are metaphors, our attempts at self-cure, we're left with a story in which our experience of God shifts from wounding to healing, from inflicting pain on us to embodied suffering alongside us. Which I take to mean, as Octavia Butler wrote, that God is change. Or Teresa of Avila, the feeling remains that God is on the journey too. That, if nothing else, God is with us in our bewilderment.
Listening to you think about and write about metaphors reminds me of a passage in Memorial Drive by Natasha Trethewey where she grapples with metaphors as the tools with which she makes sense of something horrible that happened to her.
Yeah.
How did, when she speaks of her father and his teaching of metaphors to her, how did you build your metaphor toolkit? How did you come to embrace and write metaphors? How did you figure it out?
I don't feel that I'm actually that good at that particular. I'm always so impressed by, these, I feel like that's a kind of magic I don't know how to do. But I think that makes me really appreciate reading it. And I think when I was writing this essay, I was reading a lot about this book, The Body in Pain, by Elaine Scarry. But she was talking about the Bible kind of having this split, and that there's an understanding of God and the relationship with the human body. It's like wounds as proof of God's existence, and that over time, as God becomes incarnate on earth, the relationship with the human body changes to healing and to taking on physical pain. And she talked in that book about how we really only express pain through these images of either the weapon or the wound. So it feels like a vice squeezing your head, or it's like I was stabbed by a knife or whatever. It's like that's our way of expressing pain. It's not necessarily how the pain actually feels, but another image of it or another comparison for it. And so I just started thinking a lot about something that Richard Dillard said when I was at Collins in the MFA program there. And he gave a talk about how there are books that write and unwrite themselves. And I thought that there was something about the relationship between the divine and the human body and our pain that seemed all very connected to how we tell ourselves, how we tell each other and communicate these stories to each other, that made metaphors feel very sacred to me. And I don't know what that says about the fact that I'm not good at writing them, but I really love reading them. And there was something about landing there where that there wasn't, a lot of the book has to do with biblical literalism or scriptural inerrancy. I traveled to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky and go to like a reenactment of the Stokes trial in East Tennessee. And I'm really interested in that. And I think there's something, even though I don't come out of that world myself, there's something kind of healing about coming to a place where I could live in my appreciation for metaphor and see it as sacred without feeling like that was some kind of a dodge or a hedge, I guess.
Yeah, I would suggest you're better at metaphors than you think you are, because you're reporting, by way of your good reporting, you end up with beautiful metaphors. When she was reporting out the Stokes trial, she realized that setting, if I remember this correctly, was it the Stokes trial or was it the Ark that was in the middle of a fossil field?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, this is very short, but I'm not going to be able to remember these numbers, so I'm just going to read this to you because I think this is wild. So the Ark Encounter is like a replica of Noah's Ark in Kentucky, and it tells the kind of young Earth creationist version of Genesis as like a science. And so this is really interesting to me. So this area of northern Kentucky is home to the Cincinnatian fossils dating back more than 443.7 million years. And the map surrounding the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum is settled with fossil parks, fossil outlet stores, geology museums, and art galleries specializing in geo-rarities. So depending on which roadside attraction you choose, you'll be presented with opposing visions of the world and its origins. One in which the world is billions of years old and the product of constant, ongoing change, or one in which the world is more like 6,000 years old, and in which all of life's forms were created fully formed in 6 days. That just blows my mind.
Well,
I think that's amazing.
It's also the practice of metaphors, noticing your world and making comparisons. It's good work.
Thanks.
So this is the juncture where we ask y'all to ask questions of Martha, which she'll be happy to answer or pontificate about.
I didn't have a question. I just had a compliment, which is I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And I guess one of the things I enjoyed, I guess no one here knows, but you and me, which is we shared our common experience at Hollins, which then went on to the beauty of that part of Virginia. And I just want to say that as you were reading, I was thinking of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And then when you were talking about metaphor, one of my favorite books from Hollins writers is Kelly Cherry's The Exiled Heart. I don't know if you know it, but she talks a lot about metaphor. And I'm a lawyer, and I actually use her book with my law students because I think one of the things that good lawyers do is open themselves up to other people's stories, often through metaphor. It's a way to sort of empathize, particularly with people who have far different experiences than you do. That's all to say that you've done a really nice job with that tradition.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I love Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. There's something about that book, it's like, I feel like it's just called nature writing. And I think it's so much more of seeing the earth as a metaphor for like different theological visions, you know?
Yeah, it's held up. It's one of those books that sort of comes and goes, but it's always there, you know, after 40, 50 years maybe.
Yeah, when Richard Dillard said that thing about books that write themselves, I was like, you mean like Pilgrim at Tinker Creek? It's an incredible book.
Anyway, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I have one more thing I want to ask you before we. So I'm thinking about we're in a bookstore, and then you wrote that stories are deep wells, infinitely plumbable. They change in meaning as we change. And you're reflecting on your father's sermons, you're reflecting on the stories you've heard over time. Where did that realization come from? What brought you to that?
Well, I think a lot of the book I'm trying to wrap my mind around like certainty, and I think I was so lucky to grow up in a house where like the first essay in the book I'm writing about how my dad would like tell me a story offhand, and it would seem to mean one thing, and then he would preach a sermon about it, and it would have a different meaning, and then maybe he'd preach about it again 2 years later, and its meaning had changed. And so it felt like a real model for me that you don't have to find one meaning in a story, and you don't have to then say, now I know what that means, I'm not coming back to it, but that there was a way that these stories that bugged you could live with you, and you keep revisiting them. And then obviously that was the same for him in scripture too, not just stories from his life. And so I think that was something I grew up with, and that I didn't realize was such a gift until I got older and started comparing notes with my husband. And I was very grateful.
Thank you, Martha. We're grateful for your time and for your book.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for coming out.